Air Marshal Reynolds, growling, "Stand up! Now." Jonathan Pierce, calmly, "Excuse me?" Reynolds, snarling, flashing his badge, "I said stand up! Hands where I can see them!" Passengers freeze. A flight attendant gasps. Tension thickens like a storm cloud. Jonathan slowly raises his hands, his sharp gaze unwavering. Jonathan, coldly, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Silence. Then, Reynolds yanks out his cuffs. Reynolds, "You're coming with me." "Terrorists like you don't belong here." Gasps ripple through the cabin. But Jonathan? He just smirks. Jonathan, deadly calm. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." What happens next? Stay tuned. The cabin hummed with the quiet chatter of passengers, the occasional clinking of glasses from first-class service, and the steady hum of the aircraft slicing through the night sky. A long-haul flight from London to New York was supposed to be smooth, until it wasn't. Seated in first class, Jonathan Pierce adjusted his tailored navy blue suit, shifting slightly as he glanced out the window. He had taken this flight 100 times before, and yet something about tonight felt different. A tension, a weight in the air that had nothing to do with turbulence. Jonathan wasn't just any businessman. To the world, he was a respected financial consultant, an investor with deep ties in the tech industry. But beneath the polished exterior was something much more, something that would soon unravel in ways no one on this flight expected. Across the aisle, Air Marshal Bradley Reynolds kept a close watch, his trained eyes scanning Jonathan with a suspicion that had been simmering from the moment he stepped onto the plane. Reynolds was a seasoned veteran, a man who prided himself on his instincts, and something about Jonathan Pierce, his confidence, his presence, set off alarm bells. It wasn't long before those instincts turned into full-blown suspicion. Everything had been routine at first. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the cabin, offering champagne refills and warm towels. Businessmen typed away on laptops. A few passengers dozed off with blankets draped over their shoulders. Jonathan, unfazed by the luxuries, casually scrolled through his phone, checking the latest market reports. But Reynolds watched him like a hawk. A small frown tugged at his lips as he leaned over to whisper to a fellow flight attendant. "Who's that guy?" he muttered. The attendant glanced over. "Jonathan Pierce, businessman, VIP status." Reynolds' brow furrowed. Something about him didn't sit right. He had seen criminals disguise themselves before, terrorists hiding in plain sight. What if this was one of those moments? What if this was his moment to stop something before it started? His grip tightened around the armrest as paranoia took hold, and then the turbulence hit. A sudden jolt rocked the plane, sending a few drinks spilling onto tray tables. Gasps filled the cabin as the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." Jonathan barely reacted. He calmly placed his drink back on the tray and tightened his seatbelt, unfazed. But Reynolds? He took the moment of distraction to make his move. He stood abruptly, one hand hovering over his holstered firearm beneath his jacket. He stepped forward, closing the space between him and Jonathan. "Sir, I need you to stand up," Reynolds ordered, his voice cold and firm. Jonathan looked up, brows raised slightly. "Excuse me? Stand up, now!" A murmur rippled through the cabin as passengers turned to watch. The tension in the air thickened. Jonathan's lips curled into a faint smirk. "Are you detaining me, Marshal?" Reynolds clenched his jaw. "I don't need a reason to pull you aside for questioning. You're acting suspicious." Jonathan leaned back slightly, studying him with amusement. "Suspicious how?" "By sitting in my seat and drinking my champagne? You don't belong here." And there it was, the unspoken accusation, the unfiltered prejudice. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his smirk fading into something colder. His fingers tapped idly on the armrest. He could feel every eye on him. He could hear the sharp intake of breath from the flight attendant standing nearby. Then a slow shake of his head. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career," he said, voice low, controlled, dangerous. Reynolds scoffed. "That's so?" Jonathan nodded, pushing himself to his feet with deliberate calm. He towered slightly over the air marshal now, meeting his glare head-on. The cabin was dead silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Jonathan said, "You have no idea who I am." And with those words, everything changed. A sudden beep from the cockpit's secure communication system, a message alert on the flight crew's monitor. The captain, deep in his controls, frowned as he read the flagged notification. "High-level clearance. Passenger Jonathan Pierce. Do not interfere." Reynolds' radio crackled to life. "Marshal Reynolds, stand down immediately." His blood ran cold. Jonathan watched the panic flicker in his eyes, his smirk returning. The other passengers had no idea what was about to unfold, but one thing was certain. Air Marshal Reynolds was about to learn the hard way. He had just picked a fight with the wrong man. The silence in the first-class cabin was suffocating. Every passenger had their eyes locked on the confrontation between Jonathan Pierce and Air Marshal Bradley Reynolds. The tension crackled like a live wire, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on everyone. Jonathan didn't flinch as Reynolds's fingers hovered near his holster. The marshal's breathing was shallow, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what he had just heard. Who exactly was this man standing in front of him? Why was he flagged with high-level clearance? But pride is a dangerous thing, and Reynolds wasn't about to back down. "I don't care who you are," he growled. "You're coming with me." The order hung in the air for a second too long. Jonathan's lips barely parted as he muttered, "You should have checked before pulling that stunt." Then, before anyone could react, the turbulence struck again, harder this time. The plane lurched violently, sending drinks spilling and passengers gripping their seats. A flight attendant lost her balance, crashing into the aisle. Overhead compartments rattled. A baby cried in the background. Reynolds staggered but quickly regained his footing. Jonathan remained still, unshaken. "Sit down," Reynolds barked, struggling to reassert control. Jonathan exhaled through his nose. Slowly, methodically, he reached into his inner jacket pocket. Reynolds' instincts kicked in. His hand shot toward his firearm. "Don't move!" Gasps erupted from the cabin. A few people ducked in their seats, afraid of what might come next. Jonathan held his ground, unfazed. He pulled out a black leather ID wallet and flicked it open in one swift motion. Reynolds' heart stopped. The emblem glinted under the cabin lights. United States Intelligence Directive, Level 6 clearance. A hush fell over the room. The color drained from Reynolds' face. Jonathan's voice was like ice. "You just pulled a gun on the wrong man." The flight crew scrambled into action, trying to de-escalate before things spiraled out of control. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "All passengers remain calm. This situation is under control." But it wasn't. Not anymore. Reynolds was now caught between orders and his own pride. He should have backed down, but he didn't. "ID doesn't mean anything to me," he snapped, masking his uncertainty with bravado. "For all I know, this could be fake." Jonathan let out a quiet, almost amused chuckle. He turned slightly, giving Reynolds just enough room to glimpse the small earpiece in his left ear, one that had been silent the entire flight. Until now. A voice crackled through, audible only to Jonathan. "Pierce, we have a problem." Jonathan's expression darkened. He subtly pressed a finger against the earpiece. "Go." "Unauthorized movement in the cargo hold. Someone's down there." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the cockpit, then back at Reynolds. The Marshal had no idea what was really going on. There were bigger problems on this flight, and they were just getting started. Jonathan's demeanor shifted. He no longer had the patience for this. "We're done here," he said flatly, brushing past Reynolds as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. Reynolds grabbed his arm. Big mistake. Jonathan moved fast. With a single motion, he twisted Reynolds' grip and forced him into the nearest seat, locking him down with an arm pressed to his chest. The movement was effortless, controlled. "Get your hands off me," Reynolds seethed. Jonathan leaned in, voice dangerously low. "You're interfering with something bigger than you understand." Reynolds struggled but froze as Jonathan pressed his earpiece again. "Copy that. I'm on my way." The intelligence officer straightened, adjusted his suit, and walked toward the rear of the plane. Passengers murmured in confusion. A few took out their phones, trying to discreetly record what was happening. Reynolds sat there, humiliated and furious. But he wasn't done. He would find out what Jonathan Pierce was hiding, and he would regret it. Jonathan reached the rear stairwell, the flight attendants hesitant to stop him. They knew something wasn't right, but were too afraid to intervene. With a swift motion, he unlocked the maintenance panel and slipped inside, descending into the dimly lit cargo hold. The faint hum of the aircraft engines surrounded him as he moved down the narrow aisle between storage crates. Then he heard it, a muffled groan. Someone was down here. Jonathan's hand instinctively went to his concealed sidearm. He pulled out his phone and used the reflection to check the next row of crates, and that's when he saw them. Two masked intruders crouched beside a cargo container, tampering with the locks. His pulse remained steady. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Who the hell are you?" The figures turned. One bolted, the other. He pulled a knife. Jonathan reacted instantly. A gunshot shattered the silence. A scream. The plane jolted again. Panic erupted upstairs. And just like that, what started as a simple in-flight confrontation had turned into a full-blown crisis. The battlefield was quiet now. The tension that had once suffocated the air was gone. Instead, an eerie stillness hung over the training ground as all eyes remained locked onto the two figures in the center of it all. Major Briggs stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides, his face red with barely contained fury. Across from him, Malcolm Hayes, bruised, exhausted but unbroken, stared back, his breathing heavy but controlled. He had faced the worst this system had to offer, and he was still standing. Colonel Henderson stepped forward, his voice sharp but calm. "Major Briggs, you are dismissed from duty effective immediately." The words cut through the silence like a blade. A murmur rippled through the ranks. Briggs' jaw tightened. "This is a mistake," he spat. "He doesn't belong here." Henderson didn't even blink. "You're right about one thing," he said coldly. "This is a mistake we should have corrected long ago." He turned to Malcolm, his expression unreadable. Private Hayes, at ease. Malcolm exhaled, his muscles slowly unwinding, but his eyes never left Briggs. Briggs scoffed, looking around for support, but there was none. His authority, his power, everything he had built his career on was gone in an instant. He had underestimated the wrong soldier. He turned on his heel and stormed off. As soon as he was gone, the recruits seemed to breathe again. Some exchanged glances, others nodded in silent respect. Malcolm had done the impossible. He had stood against the system, and he had won. Colonel Henderson faced the recruits. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," he said. "True strength isn't about power. It's about integrity. It's about standing for what's right, even when you stand alone." His gaze settled on Malcolm, and today we saw what that looks like. A slow clap broke the silence, then another. Within seconds, the entire training ground erupted in applause. Malcolm swallowed hard, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. It wasn't just a personal victory, it was a statement. For every soldier who had ever been doubted, for every recruit who had been told they weren't good enough, for every man who had been set up to fail just because of who they were. That night, as Malcolm lay on his cot staring at the ceiling, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about proving himself anymore. This was about change, because men like Briggs weren't just in this camp. They were everywhere, And if today had proven anything, it was that standing up mattered, that fighting back mattered, that no matter how impossible the odds seemed, justice could still win. What do you think? Let's talk in the comments. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe for more powerful stories that need to be told. Share this video, because if we don't tell these stories, who will? Because at the end of the day, power isn't about rank. It's about standing for what's right.